Ray Dalio. Thank you very much for joining us on the show, Ray. Your book studies 48 debt crises and then derives lessons on how investors should understand which stage of the debt cycle we are in. So at the moment, you believe, your book says, that the US is in a similar stage as it was in 1937. And in 1937, 7 years after the Depression, the stock markets had risen and then they fell 60% in 1937. Do you see something like that now?
I think that, there are three parts to a cycle, an economic cycle. Over a period of time, there's productivity, we learn more and we raise our living standards. And then there are two debt cycles. One is a short-term debt cycle, a business cycle. You have a recession, central banks stimulate monetary policy by either lowering interest rates or printing money and buying financial assets. And then that pushes asset prices up and it pushes the economy up until you reach the part where they want to put the brakes on the economy to slow things. We're in that part of the short-term debt cycle. There's also a longer-term debt cycle that is the accumulation of all of those. And that is, you can judge that by seeing how close the central bank is to, the reserve central banks are to zero in their interest rates. We have a situation where the United States has very little capacity, about 3%, to lower interest rates. And the other central banks have, European Central Bank and Bank of Japan, have zero interest rates and really don't have a capacity to lower them or print more money. So we're in the late stages of that long-term debt cycle, and we're in a rather late stage of the short-term debt cycle when central banks are putting on their interest rates. Asset prices then have become fully priced because they've benefited from all that stimulation, all that purchasing, $15 trillion worth of printing of money and buying financial assets has pushed them up a lot, put a lot of liquidity, produced an important improvement in the economy. But they're now putting on the brakes because we're in the late part of that cycle. That means that asset prices generally are relatively expensive. We don't have a situation where we have a big debt crisis on the horizon. We have a debt squeeze that'll emerge on the horizon. What is important in this cycle is that we have a big difference in the financial conditions of different people. The rich and the poor, the polarities become greater. And so we have greater amount of populism that exists now, which would make the next downturn in the economy more difficult. There'll be more conflict. Populism is a big effect. And then we also have the emergence of China, and to some extent India, but particularly China, in terms of competition. Most importantly, China in terms of the geopolitical and being all over the world. So I would say that's the character of the environment in relationship to the cycles. All these cycles have happened over and over again, and the period we're in is quite like the late 1930s because central banks don't have much ability to ease if they're turning down, and they're beginning to tighten monetary policy. 1937 is when the Federal Reserve and some other central banks tightened monetary policy, and we're in a position similar to that now, I think.
Okay. Ray, well, you know, in your book, you praise the trio of Hank Paulson, Timothy Geithner, and Ben Bernanke. And your advice to central bankers in the heart of a debt crisis is don't tighten too much in a debt crisis, right? If you can explain that.
They should err on the side of, you know, no central bank ever gets it perfect. That's why we have recessions. And there is not a broad inflationary pressure because of things that are changing in the economy. And so there is, most importantly, asymmetric risk. In other words, if you have a downturn in markets and the economy with this kind of polarity and this kind of environment, it's riskier also because central banks have less ammunition to reverse a downturn then they have ability to put the brakes on the economy. So for that reason, the thing that I'm watching is how they're tightening relative to which is already reflected in the curve. In other words, prices in markets reflect expectations. And in the interest rate market, prices reflect the rate at which they expect central banks, most importantly the Federal Reserve, to tighten monetary policy. And if monetary policy is tightened less than that, it will be supportive to asset prices. And if they tighten by an amount which is greater than that, that will adversely affect all asset prices in the economy. So I think that having monetary policy along those lines would be wise. Now, that's just today. The reason I wrote this book, and I made it free for everybody who wants to read the book. You can download it as a PDF file free at principles.com. The reason I did that is I want people to understand for themselves how to look at these cycles and position themselves appropriately in that cycle. So what I'm saying is I want them to be able to see why central banks are tightening, what that means for asset prices, and what that means for their positioning for the economy or the markets.
I got that, but still, if you can explain, in 1937, even as stocks fell 60%, the world saw a rise in commodity prices. Do you think we could see a sustained rise in commodities now as well?
Again, I want to reemphasize, I could keep talking about what I think about the economy and markets and keep talking about today, and I won't convey my real purpose here. And that purpose is to convey how the economic machine works so that your readers or your viewers will have that good template. And so I want to answer your question in light of that economic cycle. We are in, if you understand what causes cycles, in other words, that you are at the point where unemployment rates are low and central banks are putting on the tightening of monetary policy, and that is reflected in the price structure. And so you now know that this is the worst part. This is a risky period for holding asset prices. And then you know that today asset prices are fully priced in as being pretty high because central banks have largely printed a lot of money and bought financial assets, and they're now reversing that policy. That you can begin to then say that the risk reward of riskier assets, and that includes stocks, that includes private equity, includes real estate, is becoming greater. And that's not an immediate problem, meaning tomorrow, although, but the next day or the next day. It means that at this phase in the cycle, that one should be more defensive and particularly more balanced in their portfolios.
All right. Well, let me try and see if you can apply your principles to the Indian situation. At the moment, India is in the throes of a debt problem, or maybe a debt crisis, where the shadow banks have grown too fast on cheap money, and now they are not being trusted with more money by the markets or the banks. How should such a crisis be handled by the central bank?
This has happened in almost every single debt crisis. And the way the way to handle it is to let it run its course and let people feel the consequences of bad lending or good lending to the point that you don't disrupt the economy, that you don't hurt the economy much. That's why we look at what are systemically most important entities. If you start to see credit differentiation, that's a good thing, because then safe behaviors will be rewarded and reckless behaviors will be penalized by the marketplace. But you must not let that go beyond the ability to get past in that. So the question is, what's systemically important for the economy in a whole, and make sure that that doesn't pass through. That's the standard, most appropriate policy. In addition, what I'm saying is by identifying those specific parts, and entities that are having bad problems and behaving that way, and treating them appropriately, precisely, focused on them and how they should handle things well, rather than treating it as a general monetary policy thing, then that allows balance to occur. Because when you change monetary policy in general, you change it for all parts of the economy. If you raise interest rates or lower interest rates, that affects those areas that you're not even trying to affect. And because there's differentiation, central banks have what are called macroprudential policies that they can go to start to focus where they should do what to keep that economy in balance. Most importantly, to make sure that debt problems don't get out of hand.
Okay, well, now let me come to the big talking point of the day, the US-China trade war. What will the end game be? The US and the old USSR had no economic relations with each other, and so it wasn't a problem when they were in a Cold War. But US and China are deeply intertwined. So how do you think this trade war will evolve?
I think there are trade issues, and the trade issues can be handled, but there's more importantly a combination of a different approach to the world, different approaches. And at the same time, the world is going to be a very small place for these two competing powers. And so in lots of ways, they are going to be competing, struggling, and having various forms of war, trade war, maybe a capital war. There are going to be issues. There are going to be conflict. And those, I would say, when you see the settlement, they were dealing with some of the peripheral trade issues. But the idea in China really is much more of a top-down way of running the economy and making a plan like the 2025 plan, in which they say this is going to make our country great, and these are the things that various entities, including the businesses and so on, need to do in order to achieve that plan. And that'll be a top-down, and that more maybe call that state capitalism. In other words, we want our country to be great, and we're going to go in the world, we're going to approach it according to that type of a plan. In the United States, it's more of a bottom-up country. One of the Chinese leaders characterized it to me. He said, the United States is a country of individuals and individualism. And because of individuals and individualism, it's a bottom-up decision-making. And with that bottom-up decision-making, we approach things differently. So strategically, there is a different alignment. You will not be able to change the nature of American approaches. So trade balance issues, I think we can get past. The way of operating together and the way of operating in the world, particularly when there are conflicts, geopolitical conflicts, economic capital conflicts. This will be with us for the rest of our lives, I think.
Oh, that's a big statement, Ray Dalio. Thank you very much for joining us.